It's great to see so many of you here. For those who are regulars at our public lectures, welcome back. Welcome to everybody else, and also welcome to I think there's 600 people registered online to watch the lecture today. So then you see we have cameras, so we are live streaming and recording the lecture. We will also be recording the Q&A. So what you ask might be preserved for posterity. It's a great pleasure to introduce Duncan Garrow today as speaker from the Department of Archaeology, who will speak about his work on the world of Stonehenge. Many of you might have been to the exhibition in the British Museum of the same name that Duncan co-curated, and he co-authored the accompanying book, which can sold over 20,000 copies and offers several 100,000 visitors to the exhibition. The project is also part of the British Museum partnership with the university. We have a range of projects, in particular in archaeology, but also across a number of other disciplines, working with colleagues in the British Museum on a range of different research projects. Duncan is also working on a virtual 3D experience of the exhibition, which I think we'll introduce partly through the lecture. Might have been able to see some of this outside earlier today, and of those of you who couldn't, I think it's still there until about 9 o'clock afterwards. So there's plenty of time to peruse that in more detail. But enough of that. I'm very happy to hand over to Duncan to talk about the world of Stonehenge.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Dominic, and thank you everyone for being here in the room and online. That's much appreciated. I feel like I need a strap line saying even older than University of Reading underneath Stonehenge, so because it's quite a lot older than us, even though we're 100 years old. So a bit of housekeeping first of all for this event, not for Stonehenge. So in the event of an emergency, please use the fire exits at the back of the lecture theatre, and you'll be directed by a fire warden wearing yellow high-vis vests to the congregation point at the front of the building. Please switch your mobiles off or keep them on silent. First aid is available, so if you need that, please see one of the event staff who've helpfully got events t-shirts on. And please do ask if you need any extra assistance. I thought I'd give you a little bit of a sense of what we were going to talk about, what I'm going to talk about today, in that order. So first of all, we'll have a look at Stonehenge itself. I'm taking a guess here, so there'll be some things I think you might know about, and some things that some of you, but probably not all of you, might not know about. Then we'll move on to the kind of main topic of the talk, which is the World of Stonehenge exhibition at the British Museum. And we'll also be looking at some of the objects that are in that exhibition from the time of Stonehenge, and thinking about how, when we put on exhibitions, we ask objects to become icons, to represent that period of, in this case, prehistory, and to tell its story through that material. And we need to, we'll talk about how you do that and the different ways that you might think about doing that, and that we did think about doing that. Then I'll ask you a couple of questions maybe, and then we'll think about what visitors thought of the World of Stonehenge exhibition itself, but also the different kinds of object we put on display. And then very quickly at the end, as Dominic said, we're working on a virtual version of this exhibition, and I'll give it right now hot off the press, and so I'll give you a little bit of a sense of what we're up to and the reasons why we're doing that, before leaving some time at the end for questions from the audience. So Stonehenge is an amazing monument, but what do we actually know? And often the answer is we don't really know everything we'd like to know, but in a way, us prehistorians, we quite like making up stories about the past. So it's quite good that we don't know everything really. But I just wanted to give you a kind of time bracket at the beginning, just to make sure you're all grounded in the timeline of the past. So Stonehenge was built around about 3000 BC. And it had multiple kind of incarnations over the next sort of 600 years before the site itself ceased to operate as a focus for lots of activity in the monument itself. And that, broadly speaking, went out into the landscape instead. So some things that I thought you might know. Probably most of you, all of you are familiar with that kind of scene up the top left. Some of you might have even taken part in it. I don't know. And that is the midsummer solstice picture today, where people nowadays are allowed into Stonehenge, which is fantastic, to see the midsummer sun come in on the longest day of the year at dawn. So as the sun rises, as you can see in this picture here, it comes down up the avenue over these stones and shines into the middle of Stonehenge. The same alignment also happens at midwinter at sunset, which is less familiar and less celebrated by people today. So in the cold of December evening, as dark comes, if you're lucky enough to have a sun, you'll see it setting on the directly opposite side of Stonehenge. And I'd always like to go on midwinter, but I've never managed it myself. Another thing I thought you might know was that some of the stones came from Wales. And famously so. And we know that they came from Southwest Wales in Pembrokeshire. We've thought that for a long time geologically, but relatively recent excavations by Mike Parker Pearson and his team on a site that was identified geologically, found the actual quarry where those stones came from. And you can see that big block almost looking a little bit sad to have been left out of the journey all the way to Wiltshire, probably by sea, and left there abandoned. I do always feel sorry for that stone, but they've worked out and excavated and found the quarrying that got the stones out, and they then got brought all the way to Wiltshire on the routes that hopefully you can see up the top left. So shout at me if I'm being unfair to you, but I thought there's a few little things that you might not know that are less common, one of which relates to the solstice alignment. So you can see on the top left picture a nice reconstruction by English Heritage of the avenue that leads away from, or perhaps more accurately, towards Stonehenge, okay? And that's where the sun at midsummer shines directly up the alignment of that avenue. So we know that the solstice alignment on the longest day of the year was important. But again, excavations by Mike Parker Pearson and his colleagues as part of the Stonehenge Riverside project that you can see in the bottom here, you can see some archaeological trenches, and you can see some features at the bottom there, but those features are geological. They're striations caused by glaciers long before humans were in this landscape building Stonehenge. But as you can see, they're exactly parallel and aligned with the alignment of the avenue. So I should have said we're looking swizzled around and looking the other direction, okay, up the line of the avenue. So one of the theories that Mike and colleagues put forward was that perhaps they realized that these geological features were aligned on the important solstice alignment, and therefore put the stones there to match the alignment, if you see what I mean, not the other way around, which is quite interesting. Another thing that I thought maybe you wouldn't know was that Stonehenge was used as a cremation cemetery. So lots of people were burnt on pyres and then deposited in the monument. So hopefully you can see on the left-hand image, all those red dots are post holes. So they probably held posts or stones known as the Aubrey holes that cremation burials were put into. So it's for a long time used as a cemetery. You can see some of the grave goods being put there, and you can see some archaeologists excavating the cremation down the bottom there. We don't have a brilliant understanding of the cremations because they were dug early in the 20th century and not recorded very well. And in fact, the excavators of those dumped them all back into one post hole, which is what these guys are digging there. Unfortunate, but also good that they didn't just chuck them. And my final guess of things that you might not know, and sorry if you do, was that, and this relates to the period after that 2400 that I kind of gave as the end date for Stonehenge having a lot of use itself. And hopefully you can see on this other nice English heritage reconstruction, hopefully you can make out, so I'm never sure about pointers, but there's Stonehenge, there's the avenue. And hopefully in this landscape, you can see lots of these Bronze Age barrows or burial mounds all around that landscape, as you can see in that photo there. So even though Stonehenge as a site stopped having so much going on at it itself, people were wanting to buy in, if you like, into that landscape and be buried in that landscape around the stones. So they knew it was kind of important. And some of the burials have really fantastic grave goods that featured in the World of Stonehenge exhibition, like the gold plaque from Bushbarrow that you can see up the top there. And we'll have a look at a couple more burial assemblages from the barrows that you can see in that image later on. So give me a nod. Did people feel like I roughly got that right? Who knew the things that I said you'd know? Hands up, please. Yeah, and who didn't know the things that I thought you wouldn't know? Yeah, so I was roughly right. Maybe I didn't upset anyone too bad. Good, I'm glad my guesswork was all right. And I hope that means you've learned something, most of you today, so that's good. Already after 10 minutes. So I'm going to move on from Stonehenge itself into the World of Stonehenge exhibition, which, as it says up there, and as Dominic, I think, said, was held in 2022 and had 190,000 visitors going round it, and over 1 million people engaged with the associated events online on YouTube, like talking to academics about things, that side of things. And the exhibition was really well received. Lots of 5-star reviews across the world's media, and people really loved it and particularly engaged with it. They felt it was an emotional experience going round it. Some of you probably in the room went round it, and hopefully you can relate to that and agree. So it was really a good temporary exhibition, organised by Jennifer Wexler and Neil Wilkin, who you can see on the bottom right there, who were the British Museum curators of the exhibition, and me as a co-curator. And what I did in terms of my input into the exhibition was Neil and I wrote the book that went with the exhibition. And in that wasn't just a case of producing a book to sell to people when they came round. It was also a way of Neil and I gathering our research thoughts and knowledge, which would then feed into what was in the exhibition as well. So that was a really a brilliant experience and something very different to my normal academic life here at the university, where I'm teaching and doing research and doing excavations and things. And it was great to be involved in something like that, and really gave me something different, and it really fascinating to do in my career. So some of the ideas that we tried to get across in that exhibition are up there in bullet points. So what we were trying to do was, people have heard of this thing called prehistory, but we wanted to maybe not demystify it as much, but let people know a little bit more what the world of Stonehenge is seen as kind of a mystical monument, which has religious ceremonies going on, and we don't really know much about it in the midst of time. And we wanted to say, yeah, that's all very well, but we want to tell people a little bit more about what that period was actually like, obviously through its objects, because it was a museum exhibition. One of the things we wanted to demonstrate was how connected people were at that time across Europe. So 5,000 years ago, people were moving right across Europe, and objects were moving too, not least copper and tin to make bronze in the Bronze Age. And we also were keen to capture the spiritual aspects of belief. So Stonehenge is kind of known as this spiritual ritual place, but we wanted to broaden out people's understanding of what people believed and how they worshipped at that time, through the objects in the exhibition. So we're going to go with Neil and Jen literally through that door, which is what you actually did when you went to the exhibition, and have a look briefly inside. And so that's what happens when you go through the door. There's a kind of small area, and then it opens out into the first kind of main exhibition space there, just to give you a sense of what it's like. And we'll have a bit more of a look later on in the talk. But that gives you a feeling if you weren't there originally. And as you went round the galleries, some of the amazing things that you would see, I'm going to tell you quickly about now. So the Nebra sky disc, famous Bronze Age object made of bronze and gold, found in Germany. And really, as you saw, it was on the front cover of the book, and a real coup for Neil and his colleagues to get that loaned to the museum. Fantastic object with the moon and the sun and the constellation, the Pleiades, possibly. And as you might imagine with a fantastic object like this, there's been a lot of debate about its meaning and significance and that kind of thing, but a marvelous, beautiful object in itself, just to show people. There were also gold lunulae, so these are called lunulae, so meaning moon-shaped things that would have been worn on around the neck, again in the Bronze Age, and interestingly, never really ever found in burials. So whatever people thought about those things, they didn't choose to bury them with people in graves, which they did a lot with lots of other material, as we'll see, including the famous mould cape. So that's, again, as you can probably tell, made of gold and is worn over the shoulders. It was found in a burial, and it dates to around 1800 BC. And amazingly, almost unbelievably, it was made from one lump of gold and being beaten and then shaped through beating, basically, into that amazing thing that you'd have worn over the shoulders. And there's our colleague in Reading, Jennifer Foster, looking, and I've got Jennifer in there because it's lovely to see Jennifer in herself, but also to provide scale for the ceremonial dirks that she's looking at. So she's looking at these objects in one of the cases, and they're massive, great bronze swordy things, yeah? But they're way too big and heavy to have been used as actual weapons that you could really effectively fight with. And as you might be able to see, that one there has been bent and twisted on purpose before, so kind of being decommissioned before deposition. And so they're known as ceremonial dirks. So people maybe had them to show off the fact that they could own an object like that. And they could possess, or what we understand as buy, something so massive and fancy. And so that just gives you an idea of some of the spectacular objects on display. And as I kind of hinted at earlier on, in that exhibition, that's just a few, obviously, we're asking these objects to represent their period, mainly in this case, the Bronze Age, and be icons of that time. And one of the things that Neil and I did, we had a funded research project around the exhibition. And the point of that research was to try and think about how we deal, what things we make icons of the period in an exhibition and more widely in our narratives that we tell as archaeologists. And that was the name of the project, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And in one of the kind of points that we are making in that project and in the research that surrounded it, so I just grabbed a few things off the internet to represent or to convey what I'm talking about. So in a way, you might see the Nebra sky disk as something really unusual, like a satellite, for example. All those gold pieces of costume, like the dress that you might wear when you're attending the Oscars, something very fancy, special, one-off and different. Or a ceremonial dirk, being the sword that at that time it was Prince Charles, now King Charles, would knight someone being knighted with, okay? So what our point was that those amazing treasures that people love to see and that we love to show to people as icons of the Bronze Age are a kind of particular subset of the material world of people at the time of Stonehenge. And one of the points we were making was that maybe really to give a realistic image of that period, we needed to think about other icons that could stand for it as well. So if we were looking at these amazing things in the bottom of the modern day, we might also want to look at cardboard and plastic bags and cars and food and things like that. So more everyday mundane things to give a more realistic sense of today and do the equivalent for the prehistoric past as well. And I thought I'd put that image because I Googled knighting, and it just the nice picture of the sword that came up was Prince Charles knighting Lewis Hamilton. So I thought you might like to know. I quite like that picture. Anyway, that's by the by. So Neil and I came up with this idea of these things being icons, the traditional things that we often show in museum displays, but we also wanted to think about what we might term as alternative icons. And this thing is from a paper that we wrote about this in the journal Antiquity. And so we kind of tried to define what we meant and what we were doing in the exhibition in this simple table. So the traditional icons, like the mold cape and all those other things, they can communicate ideas in a single artifact. They're often colourful. They might be aesthetically striking, shiny, really visually memorable. They're often made of precious metals that last. They're seemingly usually skillfully worked by people with maybe specialist knowledge. And all of that is taken to suggest that they maybe were owned by important, powerful people, the people that go to the Oscars or that do the knighting or whatever. And alternative icons, by contrast, might be a bit different. So they might need a bit more context for people to understand. They're often overlooked, they're a bit duller. They might be made of organic materials that usually disappear, but in very rare circumstances don't. And they could be made using common or everyday knowledge that everyone might have, and most people could make these things. Connecting those objects to people like us, not the people that go to the Oscars or do the knighting equivalents of in prehistory. So we wanted to explore those things and how they would work in an exhibition context, as well as the really amazing things that we needed to have in the exhibition to show off the brilliance of the Neolithic and Bronze Age. So what I'm going to do now is tell you a couple of stories about some of the alternative icons that we displayed, give you a sense of some of the stories that they might tell, and also I'll be honest with you about the challenges of exhibiting the not fancy stuff, okay? So our point was that we need to make it, perhaps we need to put on a more representative version of the past for people to see when they go to the British Museum exhibition about the World of Stonehenge. But also we wanted to put them on because they do, and hopefully I'll convince you by telling you a couple of the stories, they have really amazing stories to tell. And it's nice to tell those stories, even if they don't involve amazing objects. So the first one that I wanted to talk to you about was this elm leaf that was dug up by Oxford Archaeology, just out in Lancashire. And it dates to around about 4000 BC, to right at the beginning of the Neolithic when farming began. And there's the elm leaf on display. It's got, I like it, it's a simple leaf and it's got its own spotlight. And it's made into an icon just by merit of being there with a spotlight on it. And this leaf, we know from analysis of social media and various things that I'll come to later, was really effective as an alternative icon. You can see, obviously, it's organic. It's an actual leaf that is 6,000 years old. And that really amazed people. And they loved getting the chance to see something that fragile that had survived for so long. So that worked really well as an icon. And the sort of stories that lie behind us exhibiting that, I'm going to tell you briefly now. So there is a classic pollen diagram from 1940, and I've done conveniently put a big red arrow on the drop in the elm pollen in people's cores, right? Don't worry, we don't have to go into the detail. But it's showing that at around about 4000 BC, between 4300 and 3200, as you can see up there, there's a big drop in elms in Britain. And people had this long debate about whether it was Neolithic people chopping it down. Now we think it might be due to disease, but human interference might have affected it. So there's this big debate about the elm decline that was lying behind the exhibition of that elm leaf. But also associated with that were these lovely axes, and you might be able to see the leaf being exhibited on its plinth just down there underneath them. So we were making that connection between axes, stone axes, which might have been used to chop trees down, and that leaf and that kind of story. And the axe wall worked, I think, generally according to what people said, really well as well. And some of those axes, so that they were actually, and I'm not sure anyone who went around the exhibition realized it, representing a generation of person for each of the years that the exhibition spanned, basically. So there's a rough chronology from right to left. But also, I think if you saw them in a normal case, in a normal museum, they would look okay, but you'd kind of maybe walk past it, maybe thinking, oh, that's quite a nice axe, as you did. But presented like that in large numbers and in a really kind of aesthetically pleasing display elevates them, and people really like that axe wall, and it made a good point as a result of that. And those axes have great stories behind them. So there's a jadeite axe, and that massive circle there in the Alps is where the jadeite axe quarry is at Monteviso. And those green dots all around Europe are known finds of jadeite axes, okay? So the story that lies behind them is that there was a quarry in the Alps, and then people valued them for whatever reason and appreciated them, and they had enough meaning to be transported all the way to the north of Scotland, up to Scandinavia and down into Iberia. So they were extending all that way. And as I said, we were trying to give people a sense of that mobility around Europe at this time, which seems almost impossible to our modern minds when we're used to flying and taking cars or whatever. The same kind of thing happened at our very own Cumbrian axe factory, which is just up on that very high peaking Langdale, where they're literally prizing the rock off the rock face to make lovely axes like that one. And that was actually in the exhibition, one of the few known ones with a wooden haft preserve. So we were trying to show the wooden preservation as well. And there is the equivalent map. So that's Langdale there. And you can see axes extending right across Britain. So again, they're being exchanged because of the way that they were valued as having kind of deep and symbolic meaning, perhaps, as well as being functionally useful for chopping down trees. Okay, so that was the first story. We're going to move forward a little tiny bit in time to around about 3,800 BC, and I'll tell you another, hopefully you'll find it, intriguing story that we were trying to tell in the exhibition. So to give you a bit of context, there are the dates of the arrival of the Neolithic, okay? So the period in which Stonehenge is built. The Neolithic is associated with farming, with the arrival of pottery, and often the arrival of monuments as well. So big, long barrow burial mounds and causewayed enclosures and things like that. And as you can see, the radiocarbon dates of that Neolithic show that it arrives first in the southeast, and then it spreads across Britain and Ireland over the next 200 or 300 years, okay? So that's what's going on in terms of the background in terms of dates. And then a really amazing thing happened to archaeology, let's say about 10 years ago and onwards, which was the arrival of the ability to look at ancient DNA on a meaningful scale. And in this case, this study really transformed our understanding of that process of the arrival of the Neolithic that I just showed you. So this was published in 2019. And what they did was they took ancient DNA out of all of those dots there on that map from Mesolithic. So that means prior to the Neolithic hunting and gathering burials, and then Neolithic farming, pottery, monuments, and often the monuments are containing the burials that the samples are taken from. Now here's a plot of ancient and modern DNA. We don't have to get into the details, don't worry. But what I do want you to take from this is that the black symbols there on the right are still maintaining that color scheme. So they're the Neolithic ancient DNA samples, and the green symbols are the Mesolithic ones from that map I just showed you. And the main thing is that they're not overlapping, that they're in separate groups, right? So that demonstrates that the Neolithic genes that came, that are in those burials were new and different to the preceding Mesolithic hunter-gatherer genes, okay? And essentially what that indicated is that it seems to have been that the Mesolithic was brought in with a migration of people from the European continent, which fits with that spread of dates that we saw. And there'd been arguments about this process for decades before this happened, and it finally seems to have at least mostly solve that answer, okay? So that's like the big picture, grand narrative story of what's going on. And now I want to take you into a kind of moment within that big picture that lies behind those maps and those DNA samples and at the scale of Britain. So what we're going to do, that's a map taken out of the book. So you can see Stonehenge there, yeah, and we're going to look at Coneybury, so just half a kilometre or so away from Stonehenge itself, at a site that has a nice story to tell about that process that we've just been looking at. So you have to imagine that if there was a migration, there's going to be the incoming people encountering the people that are already there at the time, and this gives us a little bit of insight into that. So what we're going to have a look at is what's been called the Coneybury anomaly, and that's because it was a geophysical anomaly on their plot. And what it was a big pit, as you can see in this very archaeological plan on the left there, dating to around about 3,900, 3,800 BC, so just about the right time of the beginning of the Neolithic and the end of the Mesolithic, as we've seen, with loads of pottery and flint and animal bones in it. So absolutely 41 broken vessels in there and loads of animal bone. And we're going to focus on the animal bone in our story. But before I tell you the story, I'm going to show you our display, okay? And so that is the Coneybury anomaly display in the World of Stonehenge exhibition. And I'm not sure about you, but Neil and I didn't feel this was the most effective display that we had in that exhibition. It's a bit, let's be honest, boring. It's got some broken pottery and some bits of bone and flint, okay? And yeah, we felt we could have probably done better with that display, and we've reflected on the different things that we could have done with it subsequently, which, you know, I might have time to talk to you about later. But the reason we put that in was because we wanted to test this story out and the alternative icon idea. And the story comes from a paper published in 2018 in Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society by mainly a team from the University of Durham. And you can see there a meeting in the forest, hunters and farmers at the Coneybury anomaly, Wiltshire. And it's it's a really good paper, and because it uses really top level scientific information, but it uses that in a really good way to tell a good story, and a convincing story and an interesting story to my mind and lots of other people's too. So some bar charts to seem scientific for you. But the main thing to take away from these two bar charts is that at Coneybury, what you get is lots of cow bones and lots of roe deer bones, okay, from that graph. So there's cow bones and there's deer bones, okay? And the other thing that you need to take away, so these different bars are different sites around the same date from southern England. And you can see that they all have loads of cows on. Yeah, that's normal. We know that cows, domesticated cows, come with the Neolithic, and people really love eating cows and beef. But the unusual thing, so black is Coneybury, and you can see that massive bar there for roe deer, right? So there's loads of roe deer from that pit, but that is not usual. You don't normally get roe deer on early Neolithic sites like that. So that's what they kind of are interested in first of all. And the second thing that they do in that paper is that they looked at the chemistry of the animal bones that were deposited, okay? And they looked at the isotopes, basically. And what you can do with those, so it's like the chemicals absorbed into the bones depending on approximately the geology that the animals lived on, and also rainfall and various other features as well. In that diagram, you can see hopefully that the black ones are the deer and the grey ones are the cows, okay? And so what that shows you is that the deer came from a more forested environment and the cattle came from more open land, okay? But in a way more interesting than that is that once you start looking at can you see up there, it says the local range. So if they're plotting in between these two lines, that means they're really local. And as you can see, these cow bones are plotting way outside those lines. And that's indicating that they're not particularly local to the place, but they are according to if you read the paper, not from millions of miles away. They're from an area of around about 20 kilometers. And so the deer are coming from very locally wooded, and the cows are coming from a wider range of places. And so what they argue in that paper is that maybe what's going on is that the reason why you've got this wide range of places represented amongst the cow bones is that they're representing different groups of people. So I've just done some schematic boxes around that. And what they're suggesting is that maybe there were 3 or more groups of people that brought the beef and the cow bones to that place. And there was maybe one group from quite locally that brought deer bones to that place. And as you know, it's unusual for cow bones and deer bones to be found on a site of that date. So the point that they make is that maybe what's going on is that there's farmers and hunter-gatherers who have just encountered each other as a result of that broad-scale process that I told you about a minute ago. And they're all coming together to have a feast and to kind of deal with that encounter. And what they do is they share their food, and the hunter-gathering people that were kind of indigenous at that point brought their deer, which is what they're used to hunting and eating and providing food with. And the farmers, with their perhaps brought in cows, brought those from a wider range of areas and all got together and had a feast and negotiated that process. So it gives you this really, like, I think, touching and quite spectacular in terms of the ideas that it encapsulates, scene of people meeting and sharing food. So I hope you'll agree that that's a nice story, a really fascinating and kind of detailed story that that makes it more human, that big picture map that I showed you before. And that's why we wanted to tell it, but we told it in a not very good way through the material culture that we displayed, which is not as cool as the Nebra Sky Disc to look at when you're in an exhibition. Yeah, and that was kind of one of the issues that we were wrestling with. And then finally, I'm going to tell you a tale of 2 burials. And I said that I'd come back to some of the burials in the Stonehenge landscape. Only one of these is from the Stonehenge landscape. That one on the left is from Bush Barrow. And you can see it from Stonehenge. It's only a few hundred meters away. It's conveniently still got a tree on it, so that's why it's called Bush Barrow. I always like pointing out to the students on field trips. And in Bush Barrow, you got these spectacular gold decorative fittings, an amazing copper dagger handle decorated with tiny, tiny gold pins, a really fantastic object. This mace head made from a polished fossil, and it would have had a shaft. The wood is a replica, but these bone zigzag things that would have decorated the shaft and not. So this amazing burial of fancy things that perhaps belonged to, according to traditional narratives, an important and powerful person. Okay, so that was one burial that we did display in the World of Stonehenge. And on the right was a burial excavated much more recently from White Horse Hill and Dartmoor. So they're both about the same date. And the amazing thing about White Horse Hill was that, as you can see there, it's in a kist, and it was in peat, really peaty, as you can imagine that Dartmoor is. And because it was in the peat, it preserved the organic remains really nicely. So we get this amazing insight into some of the organic, perhaps you might say alternative icons relative to those ones there, things that were buried with that person. So you can see up the top some wooden ear studs, and you can see in the middle that beautiful bracelet made from woven cow hair with tin studs embedded within it. Tin really important in the beginning of the early Bronze Age. Down the bottom you can see a basket that was preserved and beautifully conserved, as you can see as well, made out of lime fibres. And then perhaps most spectacular of all, a skin from a brown bear that was also caught up in the burial with all those things. Yeah, so they've put a brown bear skin. Brown bear would have been around at that time still, but that whatever story that has to tell, the mind boggles. But they included it in the burial. I'm just meaning, think about catching brown bears when you're in the early Bronze Age, quite hard and scary. And so we've got all these fantastic organic remains from that burial, uniquely preserved because it was so peaty, to kind of compare and contrast with that fantastic precious metal that survives much better and therefore and is much more visibly fancy or precious looking, and has normally formed the backbone of our interpretations. Whereas we thought those organic alternative icons were equally interesting in their own ways and representative of the prehistoric past. So I'm not quite ending, but I am going to end momentarily and ask you guys if you had any thoughts about the validity or what we're trying to do and the aims that we should have had, and what you think, how it worked and what you've seen so far of the icons and the alternative icons down below. So does anyone have any, is anyone brave enough to have any thoughts on that? What do you think of the idea of doing it and what we should be doing in terms of representing the prehistoric past? Thank you.
Was there an audio guide associated with the exhibition?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What?
It struck me that
Yeah.
a good 10, 15 minutes talking about the pit and the bows
Yeah.
and so forth. And of course, a lot of people will pass through and they spend 10 minutes or 15 minutes. That's quite a record, I would say.
It would be, yeah.
So I guess the point being that you need to capture the imagination in a few sentences quite quickly as they pass through. So if you did that, then I don't know what more you could have done, really.
No, thank you, and you're absolutely right that is the problem, and the issue that you wrestle with is, like, Neil will complain that he only had 100 words or whatever it was for every single label, which is nothing for an academic who wants to ramble on for 10 minutes like me, and tell the great stories, right? And it's hard to do that, so you have to find that kind of compromise between telling the story and showing good objects, I think, or and you're saying maybe the audio guide would have helped tell that longer story had people chosen to follow it. Yeah, so absolutely a really nice point, and I agree, I think. Did anyone else have any thoughts on what kind of things you'd like to see? Yeah, go on. Yeah.
My partner was watching the live stream, and I'm kind of wanting to know, like, what your favourite piece of the exhibit was. What did you have the most fun researching and just putting out on display?
Yeah, good question. So what was my, or maybe ours as an exhibiting team, favorite object, and researching the stories behind it, right? So that's a really good question. I think it's hard to say what my favorite, because I enjoyed seeing some of the things that I'd seen only in pictures, and then I saw them in real life. That was a really amazing and special thing to be able to do. And I love the crazy tall gold hats that they have, which I haven't shown you a picture of and things. But I think the fact that we were able to exhibit Stonehenge there was pretty cool. And that was something that I think it was famous for a brief while it was being excavated, because it had a lot of Druids were not happy about it being excavated, so it got a lot of press coverage, but then it got kind of forgotten about. But it's a wooden monument dating to the same time as Stonehenge, and really has a lot of interesting stories to tell. There was a tree stump uprooted and put upside down behind it, so that was in a way one of my favorite things that we got a chance to exhibit and let people know about, and in a way contrast with Stonehenge in a really nice way. So yeah, go on. Yeah.
I went to the exhibition.
Yeah. It's going to work.
And I must confess, like probably many other people, I assumed that nothing organic would have survived from that long ago.
Yeah.
So in actual fact, whilst I loved the shiny, sexy stuff, I was astonished and spent a long time looking at the organics, because I couldn't quite believe that you were genuinely telling me it was that old and it had survived. And being able to see that in context, and I found it really moving. So although you might say that display wasn't,
brilliant aesthetically,
but actually with a bit of context to say, this means that these two groups of people were just hanging out and having a kind of party. It was quite astonishing, and I think maybe that's why that exhibition was so well attended and got such massive reviews, because you were really showing something that that I couldn't quite believe actually existed.
Yeah. No, that's
and you could connect with.
Yeah, no, that's really nice to hear, and really, thanks. You can come again and answer on the right. And that wasn't a plant at all, but absolutely. And that point brings me helpfully onto the next slide, which is going to fit really nicely with what you just said, which is good. What we did is as part of that broader research project, we had more money than you would normally have to put on an exhibition to do research around it. And one of the things that we did was analyze social media associated with the World of Stonehenge exhibition on Twitter, which has now become X, and on Instagram, to see how people were representing it through their social media, because we want to know how people are engaging with our exhibition beyond just talking to them, which we also did, and is more normal. So this graph is of my invention, so it's a little bit hard to read, I'm sorry. But above the x-axis is things that relative to the number of them were photographed more, and below the x-axis is things that were photographed less than there should have been relative to the number of them in the exhibition, okay? And the colours are kind of material. So you can see lots of grey ones up above, and those, interestingly and surprisingly to me and Neil, are stone. So, and there wasn't masses of stone in that exhibition. There was quite a lot of rock art and those kind of things, and stone balls and stone mace heads. So they're photographing them preferentially, and they're also photographing these pale green bars, which is bronze and gold. So things like the Nebra sky disc, or some of that burial assemblage from Bushbarrow that we saw. And then the ones down, and then, as you can see there, wood, okay? This is ordered by section around the gallery, but that's kind of not relevant to this talk. It was relevant to the paper. And then these big ones down below are black, which is mixed materials. So like that Conanbury pit one that I didn't like and we showed you before. And the poor old red ones, which upset Neil because he's really a pottery specialist, are pottery. So people relatively less photograph pottery, mixed materials, and interestingly bronze. So that's what people did on social media. And here's a different representation that really picks up on your point, so that's Instagram up the top there. And you can see stone, gold, bronze and gold, and then quite a lot of organic there. And this one down the bottom is what our qualitative interview data said. And there you can see they've got stone, gold, bronze and gold, but the biggest bar of all is what you picked up on, which is the organics, okay? So they're not photographing the organics, but they are talking about the organics as being memorable. So it's exactly what you were saying. And I think in a way they might be less photogenic, and it kind of hopefully proves my point that they're not that photogenic, but they are really interesting to talk about and amazing to see in a different way. And the fact that they were mentioned so much in those interviews was really rewarding, because it kind of demonstrated that our alternative icons were kind of working. So just to finish up before questions, I'll just give you a little bit of an idea of the virtual world of Stonehenge, which is a project we're currently working on at the moment. Neil and I slightly panicked, I'll be honest with you, a week or two before the end of the exhibition, partly because we'd been doing research into other exhibitions of this period for our research purposes. You can never tell what was in them very well. Like, you might be able to get a list, but you have some photos, but not loads of photos. You'd probably have more on social media nowadays, but you couldn't. And we thought, the exhibition's going to go in a few days' time, and that would be really sad. So I literally texted my friend Felix in Southampton, and he is an expert in laser scanning and 3D modeling, and Felix and Michael came down at the drop of a hat, great stars that they are, and made a 3D model that some of you have been looking at the 360 photos in the VR goggles outside. And I'm just going to show you a little bit of an idea of what it looks like now. Hopefully the technology will work. Sorry about this incompetent going around it, which is me. And it's basically, you get the idea. So you can experience the exhibition in a way that you would kind of do with Google Street View or that kind of thing. I quite like the way the sun's come up in that shot there, and we're going to have a look at Stonehenge there. We're going to swizzle around and have a look at the timbers and look back down the gallery. And one of the cool things that you can do now is you can whiz out and see what they call a doll's house view. So, and I was saying to Nick, we saw this for the first time the other day because they'd only just managed to make the model work in that way. And I was saying to Neil, you should show it to the designers because they will never see it like that. It's reality, but in a way that you would never actually experience that reality. What we're going to do is one of the reasons why we want that doll's house is because we've done focus groups and we know ourselves that in a way wandering around an empty gallery a bit like Google Street View is fine, but it's not always that rewarding to do for ages. It's not. And so the research that we're doing around this project is to try and find out what people do like doing and what will work well and make that experience better in different ways than going around the real thing, not replacing it, but different. And one of the things that we might do is tell those stories better, because you can do that in different ways than you could do in the actual exhibition. And just to give you a sense, sorry, it's not, there we go. So what we'll do with the doll's house is we'll have a sort of menu as well, is we'll have hotspots like you can see there. So that hotspot's on the axe wall, and you'll be able to look at the exhibition and go, right, I want to go and have a look at that. And then we'll be able to highlight certain axes and people will be able to click on them and look at 3D models and find out more information about that. And we're going to essentially try out about 12 different enhancements, including looking around the landscape of Stonehenge itself virtually and that kind of thing as well. And then we'll do focus groups to find out what people think about that. And then we'll say, people like doing this and they enjoyed this. And this is maybe how you could do virtual exhibitions generally in future, which have become a bit of a thing since COVID. But I'm not sure anyone's done particularly effectively as yet, when we're going to try and do it effectively, obviously not badly. On that happy note, that's the end of the talk part of this evening. I'd like to thank you for listening and offer you the opportunity to ask any questions if you have any. So, do we need the microphone? I'll leave the microphone choosers.
I just wanted to ask, what were the circumstances of the soil or waterlogging that the leaf managed to be preserved in?
Yeah, so it was a paleo channel, so an old river channel basically, that was still waterlogged in similar kind of silts, not peat but silts. So because it was still waterlogged, they had amazing preservation of organics there, and they didn't have necessarily such spectacular objects as the White Horse Hill burial, but they had these crazy, those of you that might remember, they had these kind of wooden trident things, massive great things that are tridents, but no one really knows what they're for. But they were wooden and they were 6,000 years old. So that was the conditions in an old river channel basically, so still wet.
Was there concerns of the leaf getting damaged being displayed?
It's a good question. No. And between you and me and however many people are online, there were loads of leaves like that. That one just got selected for special treatment by, it was probably a particularly nice looking one. And that was a sad thing, that you don't really want to tell people because it's that moment, isn't it? But actually there are lots of moments because they were all leaves in the bottom of a river channel that had kept them preserved. So yes and no, and Oxford Archaeology North were really nice about lending things, so that made it very easy as well. Good question. So there's a question there.
How many stones are there in Stonehenge?
Oh, don't ask me questions I don't know the answer to. That's very mean. Lots. How many do you know? You don't know the answer, do you? No, I thought you might do. Yeah, I really should know the answer to that, but I don't. But maybe ask your mum to make me find out, and I'll tell her and she can tell you. How's that? And also it's tricky because now there's a certain number. They do all have numbers, so they will know. But you know, some of the stones are missing, aren't they? So some long ago there would have been more. And the other confusing thing is that they took stones away and put new stones there. So then in Stonehenge itself, they changed all the time, the number of stones. So even if I gave you an answer, it would be only right in one way, and it would have changed a lot in other ways. But good question, and thanks for putting me on the spot. Here's another question down the front.
How do you know how old the leaf is if it's just buried and looks like a leaf?
Yeah. Also a
Good question, and one I can answer, so thank you for that. What they would have, so they wouldn't have dated, I don't think that leaf in itself has been dated, but the layer that it was found in has been dated, and they can do that through radiocarbon dating, which I won't go into, not least because I'm not very good at explaining radiocarbon dating, and I don't do that lecture, thankfully, do I, Gundula, on the first year module. But they would have dated the layer, and so they know what date it is through that. Yeah, but good question, because if it was a Bronze Age leaf or an Iron Age leaf or a 10-year-old leaf, it would have looked the same. I agree. Yeah, so that's the amazing thing, isn't it? In a way, yeah. Good question. Yeah, you got one there.
One question from me is, who and how named Stonehenge as Stonehenge? Who came up with the name?
Now, that is a question I almost know the answer to, but don't quite know the answer to. I'm not going to say because I'll get it wrong, but it's like in a medieval history account. No one knows the answer to that, do they? Everyone's asking difficult questions today. Thanks a lot. Can I get back to you on that one? But a henge is actually has now become the earthwork monument, and the stones are incidental to it. Maybe it was Stukely. I think it was before Stukely that they named it Stonehenge. Yeah, I'm not going to answer because I'll get it wrong, but that's a good question. Sorry to be so bad. Maybe there'll be an easier question up the front here. There's a question here.
He goes, I'm just interested to know how you know that the ear studs are bobbing. Or
Good question.
Can you answer that one?
If I couldn't, I'd just have to leave, wouldn't I? This guy sounded like he knew what he's talking about, but I'm not sure anymore. But yeah, there is debate amongst people, but the reason why they think they're ear studs is literally from the position that they're found in burials. So I remember we found it's a burial that one of the first sites I worked on in Cambridgeshire, and there was a Crouch burial, and it had one of those, and it kind of ends up there, but it's in the position of the ear. But you're absolutely right to ask, and it could be different bodily modifications or a functional thing, but that's why they think they're ear studs. So good question, especially because I could actually answer it, so that's good. Thank you. And there's a question, Hannah.
Thanks. How difficult is it for an exhibition to go on tour? Because obviously London is one place, but there's the rest of the world.
Yeah. And that's partly the agenda behind us trying to do that virtual version of it, so that people that can't travel to London, even from within Britain, can see it. It will be freely available, that kind of thing. Getting those objects there was immensely difficult and cost a lot of money. And actually, a substantial portion of the amount that the exhibition costs to put on is arranging for those things to come from across Europe. And that's what makes it so amazing to see all of those things. But it would be so there was a certain amount of stuff shared with Haller that owned the Nebra Sky Disc, and the BM lent them some objects, and they lent that and others back in return. And they kind of pooled a bit of their resources and had quite a few shared objects in successive exhibitions. But I think, and also the difficulties of putting all the loan agreements and stuff in place would make it almost logistically hard. So does that answer your question adequately? It's difficult, but not impossible. but it costs a lot of money and it's logistically challenging to move that stuff around. And often someone has to go with the object to make sure it's safe and stuff like that. And you can imagine the getting some of the, we didn't quite see, but there were some quite large stone slabs from Italy and places like that that you literally have to drive because there's no way to put them in the post or on an aeroplane. So it's challenging. But, you know, Neil and Jen, in choosing those objects, I think they just went for it and put great, and what was one of the nicest things for me as someone interested in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, and always a bit uncertain in myself in being that in the wider world and wondering if everyone likes it as much. But then you did that exhibition and people really loved it, and you think, great, people do like our period. It's really nice to see and rewarding because it is really cool, and you could show them some really cool things. So that was really nice. It would be nice to put it around, but it's hard. Yeah, good question. Back there, yeah.
You had some wooden pieces in the exhibition on display. I think you called it Stonehenge.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, why were the Druids mad about it being excavated?
Because they...
And like,
yeah, so it was found in Norfolk in the intertidal zone. So the sands on the beach move, and because of the sea, and the sea washed the sands away and revealed these timbers. And it was decided probably by English Heritage that the monument was going to get trashed really by having been exposed by the sea because it was in the intertidal zone. And so they decided they wanted to excavate it and get the information before it got trashed. And so people went in to dig it. But the Druids of the modern day saw it as a kind of sacred site. It's a bit like, not quite like taking the stones out of Stonehenge, but basically like that. And so they found it really upsetting that people were destroying this monument. And so they did a lot of protests against it. And it was already quite tricky to dig it because you could only do it at low tide and very wet. So it was a challenging excavation all round. But it was like a circle of timbers with an upturned tree in the middle of it that dates to around about the same time as the stones of Stonehenge. So does that answer your question? Okay, yeah. But yeah, good question. And actually, there was another one revealed on the same beach, a second one, and they decided not to excavate it because it caused so much upset and difficulty. So they just left that one to the sea. So there's a really good archaeological paper about it, and they did lots of tree ring dating and things like that. So we knew a lot about that site as a result of removing it, but it caused a lot of problems doing that as well. Yeah, good question. Do you want to go first, and then because you've got the microphone first, and then you could go?
Do you know what's next for Stonehenge?
Do you mean in relation to tunnels?
Research.
Research, yeah, good question. Really good question. Not much that I know of at the moment. I mean, Mike Parker Pearson, who I mentioned a couple of times, and his colleagues did a load of work in the 2000s all around that landscape at the quarries in Pembrokeshire, and that really transformed our knowledge of that landscape amazingly well. It's a massive project. It got a lot of attention, but it kind of deservedly so because they found out loads of stuff. But as for upcoming things, I don't know of anything really. People continue to do work on the material that's already been dug up. So relatively recently, they were able to do the isotopes of the cremations that they found in the burials, and they were able to work out that some of the people buried there had a geological signature that could have been from Southwest Wales as well. So you don't know that for certain, but it was one source area that it could have been. So there's things like that going on in terms of stuff that's already been dug up, but new work around it. It's a good question. I don't know of any. It stressed me out too much to dig around Stonehenge, so it's not going to be me doing that. It's fine to show some stuff, but yeah, good question.
I was just going to say I might have missed it. So sorry if I did.
I always worry about that when I ask a question too.
What's happened to Stonehenge now?
So it's in a museum in Norfolk basically, and it's displayed like that. It's King's Lynn Museum. The tree stump couldn't come out from there to the British Museum because it was too fragile and it would have cost too much basically. So in the end, the designers did a nice, it was like an engraved glass panel of it, and I think it worked really well. And it didn't. I kept saying to Neil, it won't matter if we can't have the tree stump. But so it's on display in King's Lynn to go and see. Yeah, we just stole a few of the timbers for a while. Yeah. Dominic, you might need a microphone. There's a question here from Dominic. Yeah. Your family wins the prize for the most questions.
You spoke about the interactions between Mesolithic and Neolithic people as they moved up through Britain. So what was that history like? Was it did they start to mix, or was it more of a hostile takeover?
Yeah, it's a good question. And that example seems like it is possibly a friendly meeting if they're feasting together. But the genetics shows quite a rapid, mostly replacement of the genetics. So, but the complication with that is that the population prior to the Neolithic was probably very small. So, and then you get a larger influx into it, and the small population in the first place would be relatively less visible. But the archaeological evidence, which is why people never really could quite be certain of the answer, is not clear on that. So you don't have evidence for significant violence or large-scale killing or anything like that. And so it's still unresolved in a way, but it was probably broadly peaceful as far as you can tell from the archaeological evidence. But I think it would be nice to have a bit more of a look into, there's various migrations that happen as well in the Bronze Age, and that looks like a significant incoming of population as well, but the archaeology doesn't straightforwardly fit that story. So it'd be quite nice to have a project that looked at the relationship between the genetics and the archaeological evidence, because they're really, neither's more true than the other. They're strands that you've got to weave into a narrative. So did that answer your question, Dom? I think it just about did, didn't it? Yeah. So yeah, but good question. Yeah, and it's when you have to use the genetics in combination with the archaeology to build up a better narrative of what happened. Yeah. Online. Yeah.
A couple of questions from a very active and engaged live stream. The bracelet of animal hair from the White Horse Hill, where can people see that? People do you know where it's displayed?
Yeah, it's in the I'm not going to remember the name embarrassingly, but it's on display in the museum in Devon, in the national park, Dartmoor National Park. So yeah, you can see those things nicely, and it's one of the main things of the exhibition there. Sorry, I don't know. I do know, but I can't remember.
And a bit of a broader one. What do you know about the daily lives and social structures of the people who lived at the time of Stonehenge? And what evidence do we use to understand that?
Yeah. So perhaps it was, people have long said that there maybe was more kind of a hierarchical social system developing by the time Stonehenge was built, and one of the reasons for those monuments was to kind of solidify that social structure. And this is one of the things that ancient DNA is also beginning to give us insight into. So there is an amazing, I'll probably tell you because it's related to that question, but it's just an amazing story of a long barrow, so early Neolithic, and they did the genetics of that at Haslerton North, and what it showed was it was one male, and then he had offspring with 4 females, and then they could trace the genetics down their lines, and so the females and then their male descendants were all buried in that one tomb, which is pretty amazing. It was just an amazing story that really blew your mind, because it's the kind of thing as a Neolithic archaeologist you wanted to know all your life, and then suddenly you could know it through ancient DNA. So that was one site, and that was a spectacular story that they told again really well, using the scientific evidence with a bit of kind of creative narrative around it. But they're now doing other tombs, and so that suggests a kind of dynasty or something like that, and that got people excited. But actually, other tombs apparently are not straightforwardly showing that story. So which is kind of good, because you don't want. So probably at the beginning of the Neolithic, lots of different kind of social ways of working life out and politics were in operation at the same time. But it's hard for us to know. And it seems like there isn't a lot of inequality in the settlement record. So in terms of people's everyday lives, you can't see massive houses or palaces like you can in, other later Bronze Age civilizations in the Aegean or something like that. So it looks like a relatively flat egalitarian population to some extent. So that's a bit of a waffly answer, and I'm not sure it's a hard question to answer. It's a big one. Hope that answered your question online. Over there. Hello.
With the Stonehenge, it might be a bit tenuous, but does that link to the uncovering of Doggerland and the outskirts of that and the civilization's tree fossils and stuff that they found there?
Yeah, so it's later than Doggerland. So Doggerland was submerged. So that, for those of you that don't know about Doggerland, it's like an area in the North Sea on the way to Denmark, basically, that was still land until relatively recently, and the channel formed properly about 7,000 BC, something like that. But Doggerland was kind of like an expanse of land in the North Sea now that was still above sea for quite a long time when the rest of the channel had already formed. But that's earlier, really. So I guess no is the quick answer. It's a bit later than that, but it's still, you're right, it's in the right geographical zone. Yeah.
Just a very quick question, which might be difficult to answer.
Oh, good. Yeah.
In terms of the period we're talking about, 3000 BC, do you have any idea of what the population might have been?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's one that people always would quite like to know the answer to, but they never really do know the answer to. So you might say maybe 1 million people is what people would, but no one can really judge it or estimate it very accurately. So it's a good question, and it probably would have been very differentially spread, at least according to the archaeology that you have. So some areas like Wiltshire has masses of archaeology in the Neolithic, and other areas are quite scarce, or Orkney famously has lots of Neolithic archaeology, but other areas are much more sparse. So it's probably more unevenly distributed now. And let's say about 1 million, which is not me just making up a number, but it's roughly what people would guess, but they are only guessing, because you can't really do it without a means to do it. Yeah, which is interesting, isn't it, when you think about it? Yeah, good question.
So what, like on the like the disc thing?
Yeah.
So there's the sun, the moon, the stars. What do the other two like thicker lines represent?
Yeah, so there's possibly, it all ties into this. I could answer this in a long way, but do you mean the other gold strips? So there's possibly a boat, and possibly in myth in the Bronze Age, they had a myth of a boat taking the sun below the sea, and then the moon would rise in this kind of cycle. So it's kind of abstract, but they think it might be a boat. And then there's these strips added to the sides, and they kind of represent the equinoxes. I might start getting into territory that I'm not entirely sure and be telling you slightly the wrong thing, but it's about lunar alignments like Stonehenge has at the solstice. Yeah. So the amount. Sorry, I could find the picture, but you can. There's 2 edges on it, and the X that they draw to each edge is those alignments in the skies, basically. So that's how it ties in even more to stars and observation of lunar phenomenon and stuff like that. Does that help? Yeah. But I can send you an extract from the book would probably be the best way to explain it. Yeah. Good question, though. Looks like it might be all. So I can hand over to you, Dominic. Yeah. But there's lots of questions, so that's all right.
No, nothing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Duncan.
You're welcome.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for asking so many great questions. Thank you for brilliantly trying to answer. Can I just we've taken a leaf out of Duncan's book and put more information online. So there's more information about other events, other public lectures, and other events as part of our centenary. As our centenary, there's also going to be a page for donations. There's a fundraising campaign, so you can contribute to future research from Duncan and other colleagues and many of the community events that we are supporting. So can I just ask you once again to join me into thanking Duncan for a great lecture, and please go outside and have a look at the virtual exhibition and try it out. It's there for another hour or so. Thank you all for coming.